we tend to forget that there is this simmering, low-level conflict that continues in the eastern part of the European continent.
Yeah, it's simmering, but don't forget the death toll over 4 years, more than 10,000 people in a population of 45 million. That's not nothing. I mean, it'd be, in France, the equivalent of about 15,000 French people dying in a war over 4 years. So it is a real trauma in Ukraine. This loss of life over 4 years. This happened to be a flare-up, which was the biggest loss of life in months. But if you look at the whole picture, it has been an extremely deadly conflict. It's perhaps not totally coincidental that this happened, Francois, on the eve of Ukraine's Independence Day, which is August the 24th, of course. That's when Ukraine became a sovereign state after the collapse of the USSR. And I think this flare-up also in Luhansk is a reminder of how the international resolve to solve this conflict has basically run out as well. You might remember when Emmanuel Macron became president, he said, I want results on the Ukraine issue, not just more official statements, and yet that's exactly what's happened. The so-called Normandy 4 of France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia have continued to put out official statements calling for the agreements to be respected, but what we see on the ground is a largely frozen conflict. Although it has to be said, Ukrainian commanders in the last few months, they said that they have managed to consolidate and actually take some of the areas in this so-called grey zone between the two sides.
The grey zone, which includes Luhansk, which is this enclave, again, near the Russian border.
Yeah, well, you've got two enclaves. They're both self-proclaimed republics: the Luhansk People's Republic, the LPR, and the Donetsk People's Republic, or DPR, obviously not recognized by the rest of the world. We can see the Donbass there, that historically heavy industry producing region in eastern Ukraine there in that map. So what does the future hold? Well, no good options really, Francois, because these so-called republics, particularly the LPR, is so dependent on Russian help, on food supplies, on energy, gas, and so forth. Before the war, about 70% of goods in shops in Luhansk, in this area, were from Ukraine, from the rest of Ukraine. Now that's dropped to about 20 to 30%. So it's Russian goods basically on the stores. And the Luhansk region, it can't really export except to Russia because of a lack of internationally recognized quality norms, not to mention the fact that, as I said, it's not recognized by the rest of the world. What does this mean for Russia? Obviously an economic burden around its neck. Russia does not want this burden forever, but what are the alternatives? Reintegration into Ukraine, that doesn't really seem possible because you've got some hardliners in the self-declared LPR who will never accept that. And on the other side, in the Ukrainians west of the Donbass, a lot of them don't like the idea of giving autonomy to these regions because it's potentially a slippery slope. There's been another idea that's mooted, which is that these two self-declared republics could merge because the DPR is the stronger one economically. But remember, this is where it gets really complicated. They've had an unofficial power struggle for 4 years, also the leaders of the so-called DPR and the so-called LPR. So it's very complicated internally as well, the politics of this, even between these two so-called statelets. And so that's why I think we're sort of condemned to seeing a continuation of this frozen conflict where Russia basically sort of keeps the Donbass as this buffer zone against EU and NATO influence, and Ukraine also treats it in a way as a buffer zone to try and push back against Russian influence, but ultimately the political status, of course, remains unresolved in the Donbass.